Well, welcome again. Welcome to today's Max Beckmann lecture here at the American Academy in Berlin, which will be a conversation between Julie Mehretu and Patricia Falguières. I hope I pronounced that correctly. Close enough? Okay. I'm Daniel Benjamin. I'm the president of the Academy, and I am very excited to begin this new semester with this hybrid event programming. So I want to welcome all of those who are tuning in this event. And I want to add, I am genuinely elated to have guests here at the Academy, live and in person, as they say on television, for tonight's event. Let me begin by welcoming two trustees who are here tonight, Hans-Michael Giessen and Regina Leibinger. And I also want to welcome the Academy Senior Counselor, Bernhard von der Planitz. In truth, there is a third trustee here tonight, and that is our speaker, Julie Mehretu. Julie's association with the Academy goes back to 2007, when she was the Gunnar Mundheim Fellow in Visual Arts in spring of that year. She became a trustee the next year and has been with us ever since. And so, justifiably or not, we take great pride in her tremendous accomplishments. I want to note that as both a distinguished visitor and an alum and a trustee, Julie tonight is both my guest and, in a way, my boss. So this is a delicate situation for me, and I plan to be on my very best behavior. The Max Beckmann Distinguished Visitorship was established in 2017, and Julie is now our fourth Beckmann visitor, following Kerry James Marshall, Arthur Jaffa, and Sean Scully. Many generous supporters were involved in creating this visitorship. Among them is the auction house Villa Griesbach, which hosted an art auction for us, whose proceeds went to support the Max Beckmann program. And I know Bernd Schultz is here, so I want to thank him very warmly for that. There are several other donors who are here, and I want to acknowledge their role in making this visitorship a reality. They include, again, our trustees, Regina Leibinger and Michael Giessen, as well as Nicole Hackert, Klaus Heiliger, and Thomas Demann. I'd also like to welcome and express special thanks to Marie-Blanche Carlier and Ulrich Gebauer from the Carlier Gebauer Gallery here in Berlin, who are hosting Julie's exhibition, which is called Metoikos, or In Between Paintings, and it begins this Friday, September 18th, 17th, and will run through November 13th. They've supported us greatly with tonight's event, and I really encourage you to go see the show. If you are unusually mobile and you get a chance to go to Madrid as well, or if you're watching this from Madrid or nearby, I hope you will go see Julie's exhibition there, also at the Carlier Gebauer Gallery in Madrid, which will be on display until October 30th. So I want to congratulate Julie on being able to be in two European capitals at once, defying all the laws of matter and physics. To begin, again, I want to welcome Patricia, who kindly agreed to be Julie's interrogator, conversation partner, and the moderator for the question and answer session. Patricia Falguières is a professor at the School for Advanced Studies in Social Sciences in Paris. She's published widely on Renaissance philosophy and art, on the birth of the modern museum in Europe, on mannerism, and on many other subjects. Her current research focuses on Renaissance technique and the inclusion of artistic practices in the Aristotelian order of knowing and making, as well as on architectural theory. So that brings me to introduce our Beckmann lecturer. Julie Mehretu is an artist of international renown when she isn't being a trustee of the American Academy. Julie lives and works in New York City and here in Berlin. She received a Master of Fine Arts with honors from the Rhode Island School of Design in 1997, a BA from Kalamazoo College, and she has studied also at the University in Dakar in Senegal. Some of you may have had the good fortune, as I did, to see the mid-career survey of Julie's work that opened in 2019 at the Los Angeles Museum of Contemporary Art, later appeared at the High Museum of Art in Georgia, the Whitney Museum in New York, and will be opening next month in the Walker Art Center, so you still have a chance to see it. What I found so powerful at the Whitney was the extraordinary scope, the really enormous ambit of Julie's paintings. And a professional art historian and curator, I think, put it much better. Christine Kim, the LACMA curator who co-organized the retrospective, put it well when she said there's an incredible sense of humanity in Julie's works, creating a space, a feel, a moment for thinking about invisible bodies, migrations, lost histories, complex communication, protest, and congregation, Kim said. The absence of bodies but the presence of humanity on pause resonates in these paintings in mysterious and intense ways. Julie Mehretu is the recipient of many awards, including a MacArthur Fellowship, the American Art Award granted by the Whitney Museum of Art, the Rhode Island School of Design Alumni Council Artistic Award Achievement, and in 2015, she was awarded the U.S. Department of State's Medal of Arts Award. And as someone who used to work at the State Department, I can only say I wish that there were more Julie Mehretus in the basement that you could take and put in your office, because we need more nice art at the State Department. Recent solo exhibitions have been in Ethiopia, in the UK, in Spain, Portugal, Denmark, and now again in Germany. To cap it all, Julie is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Letters, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and her global representative is the Marion Goodman Gallery in New York. I'm going to hand it over to Julie and Patricia, but let me just say a few words about the structure of the evening. Their conversation will last about 40 minutes. Then there will be an audience Q&A. If you are here at the Academy, I think you know what to do if you want to ask a question. Just raise your hand. If you are joining us via Zoom, please do not raise your hand because no one will see it. But instead, type your question in the Q&A function on the Zoom screen and send it in. You can start sending them in whenever you want. Patricia will be able to see the questions and will get to as many as she can for Julie to answer. And we apologize in advance if they can't all be answered. So with that, let me turn it over to you two, and thank you so much both for being here.
Let's do it. Perfect first image.
Thank you.
Well, we have a lot of things here.
Okay.
Okay.
Start with the coffee.
After that.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Patricia, for making the trip here and to be so willing to be in conversation. And to Nairi Bagramian for the wonderful connection and suggestion. And then also Tacita Dean, who is in conversation with you, who's not here. But, and then to the Academy for hosting us and for having us here today. Thank you. And also to Maya Blanche and Ulrich for everything.
Thank you.
And friends who came, all of you, you know who you are.
Thank you for your hospitality in Berlin, and the city is so dear to my heart. So this is fantastic. We had this first image you choose, and I wanted to start with a kind of back to the end of the 90s. Because at the end of the 90s, when you started to paint as a professional painter, you made a decisive choice, very surprising if we look back on it. Everyone rushed to return to painting, that is, to return to figuration, and you made a diametrically opposed choice. You went for abstraction. That was at the end of the 90s. And now, the situation is quite dramatically different. Today it is figurative painting that seems to have become political. It's no longer just a market opportunity, but a purpose. a claim for recognition and identification, a place to be taken back in the history of art. So, in both cases, in the end of the 90s and now, you are working against the grain. Would you tell more? Because I think if we were talking about chess game, I would say you invented a kind of new opening, in a way. So, can you tell about the first choice you made at the end of the 90s? Does it mean that you didn't want to renounce to the political utopian dimension of abstraction?
It's so interesting because I think, like, for me, there was this insistence on abstraction that happened very intuitively, and I don't think that I was conscious, really, and really understood even why. But I mean, I know why I avoided representational form of work because of the definitiveness of it and because of its legibility. And there was like maybe too much at hand in what. And maybe that is because of who I am and how I've been raised and coming from Ethiopia and being raised in the States and really constantly seeing everything in a multitude, like knowing that there are these different issues at hand, just in play with who you are and then with the world around you. And I think just being raised in that situation where you're in between, and so like that's the title of the show today, this kind of in between place, or Gloria Anzaldúa refers to it as the borderlands, or being a borderland as a state, as a way of being. And I think that there's something in that space where one form of representation could never be enough. Like, you couldn't use some kind of Ethiopian motif. Like, some Ethiopian artists have asked me, like, questions like Mulatu Astake, who's this amazing Ethiopian jazz modernist, who asked me when he met me, how come there's no Ethiopian motif in your work? And I said to him, I mean, you of all people are asking me? You brought Latin music, you brought that with the Cuban music to Ethiopia and shifted what modern music could be. So yeah. I think for me, it was really the resistance against wanting to kind of define oneself in that particular way. And abstraction afforded that space and that freedom. But then through working with the language that was coming out through what I experienced in school, it became a space that you could really activate and interact with in a different way. And there was also a trend of particular artists really working with abstraction, especially coming out of the digital form. So you have artists like, Laura Owens was there. As much as she was working representationally, there were certain abstract elements that she was playing with. Ingrid Kalam was doing certain kinds of strange paintings. You had people like Jeff Elrod that were doing these paintings that were really complete Photoshop drawings, just traced in. And so you had that element of kind of digitally informed abstraction. And so for me, and then you had artists that were really playing with the archive, like Matt Mullican and Alan McCullum and other artists like that. And so I think it was about playing in between these places, and that abstraction could be this space there and afford new kinds of possibilities and places of invention.
So you didn't feel isolated in your choice at that moment?
No, and I think there was weirdly, we were just talking about, Matthew and I at dinner, that there's almost this sensibility that like everything's kind of a mishmash, and I feel that it was very similar in the late 90s, there wasn't really a form of, I think there was this loss of what could be really interesting, and so you have things like Chris Burden's Pizza City, which was a really important piece at that time, or, and then the 93 Biennial had all this kind of work that was very informed by identity politics, and then that was quickly denied its potency in contemporary art. You had the reaction to that with like Dave Hickey's air guitar and texts like that. And so really this kind of go back to, formalist kind of aspects of like new inventions in beauty and, Hal Foster's book on beauty and things like that were really the kind of primary texts at that time. And I don't know, I think that there was a place of like wanting to kind of incise that with something else.
But I remember several times you said you were challenging the intention of the artist, because a lot of works nowadays working with the image are quite frontal and with an intention which is given to be recognized immediately. And I remember to read that you were challenging this idea of intention of the artist and the frontality of a position.
Yeah, I think that there was, and I think even now, I think that's really a big problem in a lot of the work that we're seeing, is its kind of effort to self-explain or to explain oneself and present oneself to the world. And somehow this concept of, especially in versions of political work or works around identity politics, you have this real kind of insistence on representing oneself because the representation of oneself was so denied within a kind of, white male kind of American and European kind of modernist history and tradition, that this was so denied that in an effort to claim space in that there's this, and there's some really amazing work that does that. Kerry James Marshall, I think, is an extraordinary example of an artist who really was able to shift and play with painting to do something else in terms of claiming that space, but also move elsewhere. And then you have artists like Kara Walker, I think, who do that really brilliantly and work within this other psychological space. But I think that there's a lot of work that is about just kind of representation of self, and it becomes, it's almost like what's the kind of neo-realist? What's that word like that I want to look for?
Yes, a kind of very low-level figurativism, or kind of.
It's kind of the social realist kind of dynamic.
Or ingenious.
And I think that becomes really problematic when you really think of if we just think about the Black tradition in the United States and the history of the Black radical tradition. It was one completely immersed in abstraction and in invention and in subversion within aspects of music, performance, invention, fashion, painting. It was always this space of and within that abstraction was such a core of that history and the kind of, and you see, I mean, from many of the artists that were denied actual space in the art world at that time, you can think of Jack Whitten, you can think of many of the artists of the 40s, 50s, and 60s, Norman Lewis, many who were kind of not included in this conversation, who are now being looked at differently. I think you have artists like David Hammons who really hold a space because Mr. Hammons played with this space of never releasing the radical tradition in abstraction and what was possible in opacity or what was possible in the space of the multitude or like in the kind of in between places, in between and in betwixt things.
It's interesting because, for instance, in Africa, at the time of decolonization, abstraction was a real weapon, political weapon for a lot of artists in Africa. And in the 90s, for instance, in France, we had a lot of collectors and curators who decided that real African art was not the abstract art, but it was a kind of genuine, authentic African art with figures, wooden figures, and so on. And I remember a text by Rashid Arain when in the 80s, which was really very tough against this kind of French exoticism and French kind of French Orientalism confronted to the African artists, refusing them the right to get access to abstraction and to structuralism in painting and so on. So it's interesting to understand what was going with abstraction at that moment, because your parents were of the same generation of the people who were enthusiastic about decolonization, I can imagine. So it's a whole story.
And it's a whole aesthetic. I mean, you can't think of the post-colonial moment on the continent, like in the end of the 50s, the 60s, fully early 70s, the forms of architecture, the forms of building, the forms of creative making, whether it was in music all the way through visual art, the form of the kind of effort in abstraction and invention and possibility in that from a historic other lens of making was really complex. And you had this kind of, I mean, it's one of the kind of stories that challenged modernism, that this kind of emergent modernism that was happening simultaneously, there wasn't this kind of European invention that was then somewhat distilled across the world or kind of exported, but that there was this emergence of these gestures. And one of the most modern, I think, we were talking about Saidiya Hartman earlier. Saidiya Hartman really goes back to this idea of some of the most early modernist, like revolutionary actions were by black women in the U.S. who had to avoid, who were denied any possibility of their humanity in terms of how they had to exist. So they had to invent, radically invent sexual freedom, radically invent how they could participate in stuff. And so within that, like, you have this constant emergence in all these different parts of the world. And I think what's really interesting is the kind of dystopic period of the 80s and the reactionaryism globally against, I mean, it's very clear in the United States, but I think it's also clear in a post-colonial moment where kind of there was a very intense reactionaryism against kind of emergent modernisms and this idea of, and this is, I think, one of the challenges with modernism in general, but this idea that you compartmentalize anything into these pure forms, and that things aren't informative with one other. Things like it's either architecture or it's painting or it's textile or it's but astronomy and architecture and painting and textile, the interrelation with all of that, which was such an immense part of world building and knowledge making, was kind of stripped down to these elements, and in that disempowering or making it, and in this idea of purity, which was, if you think about it, it's so great, like it's there, you see the failures in that. And we are experiencing those failures, but I think like when you think about where that's all coming from, I think there's all this, like, there's a kind of this loss in what is possible. And then intentionally, in that post-colonial moment of the kind of 80s dystopic reactionaryism, which became kind of a neo-colonialism, that's when you have the eradication of those efforts. And the denial of that as part of the canon, or as part of the center, or part of the conversation. And I think, I mean, in the United States, it happened socially, but it happened creatively as well. You really saw activists like Norman Lewis working immensely in abstraction and incredible work, but denied, I mean, in participating, wanting to participate in institutions where they grew up not being able to go to these museums, and then after Jim Crow, they were able to go to these museums, but then they couldn't even exhibit in certain contexts. And so then you had this like strange desire of like outsider art or authentic art, and this is the same kind of like flattening of culture and a kind of supremacy of knowledge in a particular way, and who can participate and who has a right to abstraction. And there's this. It's really an interesting, strange history.
I think one of the things your work does show is the fact that abstraction is not about the loss of the figure, of the loss of the object. It's about recreating the kind of space in between the canvas and the viewer. And we see that in all your work, and there is a very strange continuity and very strong continuity in your work on that issue. Because you invented something, a very tricky relationship to images. Because in a way you bury them in the painting. And I wanted to know exactly, because this is a very strange and beautiful strategy. We have the image, but they are not given. You always speak about your canvas as palimpsest, and you invent a fantastic strategy. Okay, let's have the images, but we bury them under the la trame, the weft, and so on. So this is really, you paint when you paint, you archive. It means people do always confuse memory and archive. The archive is exactly the contrary of the memory. The archive is made to forget. When you archive something, you don't have to think about it. It's not memory. It's exactly the contrary. So when you paint, you are archiving. You bury the image in the superimposed frames in the substrate of painting. And I was really impressed by the way you organize the substrate. And I was wondering, is it a matter of forgetting, of eraser on one side, or is it something else? It means, can we think that the images are so precious that they must be buried in a crypt, preserved there as a very precious thing that must not prevent us from thinking? I think you have both possibility.
Right.
There is a kind of ambivalence in your work, which is very fascinating, because I think this is the ambivalence of painting itself. And I must say, the more I was looking at your work, the more I was thinking of the magic block of Sigmund Freud, you know, this kind of toy for kids, which is made with layers of wax. And you can write at the top of the block, and the more you write, the more the written words are digging into the wax. So you have always a white canvas, but as a matter of fact, under the surface, you have a whole text who has disappeared. And I was really interested by the kind of temporality of your pictures.
Right.
And I wanted to ask you what kind of viewer you are waiting for. Because it's a very special viewer who can see your work.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, I don't know, I guess I'm making them and trying to participate in viewing them at the same moment. And, and you know, I really am making them in a way from this very kind of like, I keep talking about this intuitive sense that is really, really crucial to like being able to kind of get to the next place in the painting. And in that, it's not this kind of working in the dark and not knowing, and it's really kind of very informed, and it's a sense like any other sense, I think, that can really be honed and can evolve and is crucial to like invention and imagination. And I think in there, when I'm working, there is this desire of whether I like how you call it forgetting, but also like trying to preserve at the same time, this effort of the ephemerality of how you can remember something, but how it also is so charged and is emotionally so provocative and can be so visceral. And I think that that those two, it's really interesting to me that every time a major step happens in the paintings, at least what I can think of as a kind of new puncture, a new kind of opening and possibility in the work, usually has something to do with, in a way that I wasn't expecting at all, the situation that we're kind of experiencing as a collective. And so that collective is a very, you know, it's a constantly mutating kind of transitional thing, but there is some sense of collective kind of understandings in particular ways, whether it's the urban history that we all are immersed in, or whether it's kind of immersive environments that are created with the more blurred paintings that I've been working on more recently. And I think the obscured image is important to me because, again, it denies a certain legibility, but there's always this kind of specter of the haunting aspect of the image that is somehow present. And to me, those are the images I choose to work with because they charge something in my reaction to, and in this space of kind of ability to work back with it and to kind of improvise within the painting. And it's in that improvisation and intuition that some new break can happen. So it's this strange, I mean, I really love the way you described it as both of those possibilities, the crypt and this kind of protective kind of aspect of not forgetting, which is really that effort to not forget, but to protect. But then also this palimpsest of also, and the kind of like subconscious that's embedded in that, the kind of psychologically, tempered kind of visceral feeling that one can have in some of the paintings. And I think parts of the bodies or parts of the landscape or parts of certain forms of architecture and space all participate in these kind of charging certain type of psychological responses. And so all of that, I think, is part of the kind of...
But what is expected from the viewer? Because in a way, it's very strange the way you play with us when we are looking at your pictures, your canvas. Because something are seen, some other are guessed or supposed. Some are present on the surface, and many others are forgotten in the layers, in the depths of the layers of paint. And some of the wefts are visible and others are not visible. And I remember once you said that architecture, generally speaking, is an invisible weft because we are surrounded by it. It's really a kind of, it's really powerful in our life, and we don't think about it so much. And there is what is exposed, what we can recognize, trying to identify, and what is encrypted. So it's interesting because I was wondering the kind of viewer you were looking for, because what you offer to us is not a space of identification, but on the contrary, a space of disorientation, absolutely. And the fact of the scale, for instance, when we see that, this is quite clear.
Yeah.
And the scale is amplifying the disorientation. This is really tough.
Disorienting and vertiginous at the same time, which happens, I think, with that painting in person. Really, you get this sense of, you can almost feel like you lose your balance if you walk through it a particular way. But I think always it's about going after a painting, a kind of a visceral experience that's somewhat transformative, that does have this kind of emotionally charged kind of reaction to it. Like, so recently I was in Prado at the Prado in Madrid, and I was looking at this painting, Zurban painting, and I can't recall the name of the painting, but the fabric and the way that the folds in the fabric were painted, I mean, we've all experienced this in different ways, completely made my knees weak. And that physical kind of reaction, how on earth does, like, the way something is presented as fabric with paint on, how does that make you feel, that kind of physical experience and transform? That to me was is part of what, like, there's this, the way that one can physically experience something in your gut or in your body that provides some other form of kind of knowledge, and so I can't define exactly what that experience is, and I know that that's a very different experience, and I think for some people the paintings are completely too overwhelming and even the most simple ones, and I think for me it's always
But it's great to be disoriented by a work of art.
Yeah.
If we don't expect that, what for?
Yes.
Why are we going to museums if it's not for that?
Yeah.
It's not like a genealogical tree. We are not looking for our fathers and ancestors.
Exactly.
We are looking a kind of disorientation to be.
And there's an opacity or like a kind of unknowing that happens in that space that is really there's a lot of potential in that, and in that disorientation there's a kind of rupture that it provides, and those moments of rupture I think are important.
Especially at the Prado, because you have really so many extraordinary
Amazing
experience of it's overwhelming everywhere.
Totally.
But when we decided to have this conversation, I was told that you wanted to speak about Renaissance. I said, oh, well, what is a relationship with Renaissance? Come on, I don't get it, and so on. And I was looking, and I think you do a whole series of very strange operations with Renaissance art, and very interesting. First, I think there is an attack at the Città Ideale, there's 3 panels, of which one is here in Berlin, of purely an abstract city, which is here to give you an idea of the perfect rationality of both architecture and perspective. And you are doing exactly the contrary of it, because you are using the traditional kind of drawing of architecture, plan, coupe, elevation, and you use it to explode the space. Or I saw that Botticelli appeared several times in your collections of photographies, but it's a very strange Botticelli. It's not the reassuring Botticelli. It's the one who is painting the cartography of Dante's Inferno, which is a kind of spiral of the underworld. And for instance, there is an annunciation of Botticelli which appears, and it's a very strange annunciation because the Virgin is on a kind of grid, of perspectival grid, but at the same time she is caught in a kind of whirling movement which is totally unbalanced. Right. So you are always, and of course, how not to speak about the Battle of Alexander by Haldorfer, which is one of the most recurring reference of your work. Maybe you want to tell us how you did choose this Haldorfer piece.
I just saw that recently in Munich, like just recently. I didn't see it in person before. I was surprised it was so small.
Yeah, because you had seen the photos.
Yeah, always the photos, and in my mind it was much bigger.
But it's the space is huge.
The space is enormous and multi-perspectival, and there was. I think that came. I found that painting through actually my first show here in Berlin in 2003, and I was installing these paintings, and a person who was working at the gallery had asked me if I'd seen that painting, and I had, but I hadn't seen it in person, and so we were looking at it again, and it was really interesting to see like the spatial arrangements that were taking place in this one painting I had here. That was really kind of, in a way, almost quoting this painting that I didn't do intentionally, but also I think with Renaissance painting, I spent the last 30 years almost every summer in Rome. My father was teaching there, and we'd always bring the kids, or we'd go and spend time. And going to Rome so regularly and going to the churches, looking at the Caravaggio's in the French church, for example, every time, and kind of being immersed in that moment, which is maybe just post that Renaissance moment. I kind of see it
at the end of
that.
Yes.
But there is this spatially what happens in those paintings, and how things occur spatially are so dynamic and complicated, and especially the martyrdom of Saint Matthew, and how that painting has, the kind of this different event that takes place from the top of the painting down to the middle of the painting, and then how each character is almost in their own perspectival space as this event is unfolding. I think those became really interesting. I've just been very interested in how these artists work with space and the events that happen. And I really think that there's so much abstraction in those paintings, from whether it's Poussin to Veronese to you have a very structural approach to this painting. It's not about making images. It's a wholly different approach. Yeah, and I think that's what was very formative for me.
Yeah. And for instance, I was very impressed by the fact that a lot of people writing on your work speak of cartography, but I was quite surprised, because what you are doing exactly the contrary of cartography.
Yeah.
It's on the contrary, because there is no possibility of any kind of bird view of a situation, which would be a position of mastering the events. On the contrary, you put us in the maelstrom of the deflagration. And it's exactly the contrary of that. And I was thinking of a photo you use very much, the stick shots of the Marshall Islands, for instance. And
which one?
This photo you use of a kind of wooden frame, and inside you have coconut fiber. It's a very extraordinary kind of cartography.
Yes.
Maybe you want to speak about it, because it's really interesting. It's all about representation.
Yeah, it's a different form of cartography, and so when I think the reason that cartography came up in early work is that the early drawings that I really came to from printmaking, because I had to reduce everything to work with an etching needle when I was in graduate school, and I had to do printmaking at the same time as painting. And in that process, everything became so tiny working with this needle that the first drawings and the kind of the way that I was thinking about them, they started to look like maps, and I started to play with the drawings as if these different marks were behaving as if they were creating a map. And instead of actually being agents themselves, they were kind of these markers of that and the traces of that. And so in doing that, then I really started to think about cartography and map making, and then look at different forms of those of map making. And so I became really interested in those reed maps of the South Pacific, and also some early Native American drawings of what are they called? They're these kind of narratives that tell about certain particular battles and historic stories, but they're really diagrammatic in their nature and in how they're put together. They're like, there's a bunch actually here in Berlin that I went to visit at one of the university's libraries, and I'm sorry I can't recall what they're called.
I was thinking too of the portulans,
Yeah.
which are not maps, which are only tools for navigating, which is a quite different purpose.
And that's about orienting oneself within the stars and the planet as a holistic
but
kind of...
without the possibility of making the point, because you don't have longitude or latitude, so you cannot be exactly, you cannot know what is your own point. You only have the indication of a route, of a way under the winds, and that's all. So it's a very different way of getting into the world and navigating into the world. It's not about the map and the territory and the masterful projection of perspective.
Yes.
It's exactly the opposite.
Is this immersive kind of like...
Absolutely.
Part of this planet.
Yeah.
It's like an earlier way of getting the overview effect.
Yeah.
Before you could go into space and see planet Earth.
Yeah, but yeah.
It's like the immersion in the overview effect. Like...
It's the reversion,
Yeah,
yes,
yeah.
exactly. So I think there's a very strong continuity in all the way you are dynamiting the perspective system, and you are working with the ghost of the perspective system, with bribes, fragments of it, and you're organizing a totally different way of relationship between the viewer and the canvas. And this is really impressive, because in most of your canvas, you feel the heterogeneity of the regimes of vision. You have different regimes of vision, and you organize those together, being incompatible. And this is really beautiful and powerful effect for the people looking at your painting. Could you tell us about a new start of your work, when you use not sedimentation of different grids and wefts, but blurring? Can you tell us about it? Because I think it's a different kind of strategy, which is important in your work.
Yeah, I mean, in the end, actually, with the latest architectural paintings, the ones that had a lot of architectural drawing in them, and they became so dense that they actually become so illegible in a way, and they kind of consume each other with the density of the numbers of drawings that are layered on one another, that they almost become like a blur. I mean, they're not, but they're very focused in a way, but they're illegible. They become this net that's almost like a kind of abstracted grid, and I think the blur I became really interested in because it was an accident in the studio, like most really interesting things. And I was looking at a projection of a photograph, and when you have these overhead projectors and you have the page kind of flips up, it's curved, and it had this kind of, you could see it on the painting, this very blurry image that seemed so much more haunting and potent than what I was trying to draw. And so then I wanted to really play with, could we paint that? Could we actually start with that form of a painting and use that as a point of departure, where that haunted image exists in all its, in the way that it... And so the blur, you use the photograph, and at first I was just using black and white photographs and blurring that, and there became these, I was very interested in the kind of ghost that would appear from, they felt like ghosts that would appear from the blurred contrast, light and dark contrast. And what was interesting is kind of you would see these things that almost look like a lynching, or that almost look like a crucifixion, or that almost look like, I don't know, some other kind of spatial kind of galactic thing that were very like haunting and referenced all forms of pop psychology to like other images that we all kind of have in our consciousness. And I think that became an interesting point of how to think about the marks as a context for the marks. And instead of like the kind of perspective you have when you're looking at some of the paintings where you have the architectural, even if it was you couldn't read it, you could tell always a window gave a sense of scale. And that sense of scale always put the viewer at a really big distance. And that more immersive kind of dynamic that I wanted could happen in the blur. Because in the blur, there isn't any kind of point of reference. It's much more like those tools you were talking about. You can't necessarily orient yourself unless you just orient yourself as your body in front of this painting, or body moving through the painting depending on its scale. So it becomes a really different kind of physical orientation with the painting. There's no diagrammatic language to show you how to engage with it. And that became really interesting to me, and especially more so because of the kind of uncertainty we're in the midst of, like that it really feels like we're in the midst of this kind of, Paul Pfeiffer and Lawrence Troy and I have this organization, Denison Hill, and a big thematic of our work right now is around the idea of the Exodus project. And we were talking about this reading group, and really trying to think about Exodus as that moment of leaving, like the post-emancipatory moment of leaving one particular form of bondage, being lost in the wilderness, and that moment in the wilderness it being this kind of place of the blur, the kind of the murmurings, which are actually described in the story, and this moment of kind of a massive uncertainty to the point of wanting to revert, to go back to Egypt, or to like reconstruct a different form of the nation state, which kind of becomes, so that in between moment, again, going back to Metoikos and that idea, or the borderland idea, it's that kind of being inside the blur allows for this other place of emergence, and kind of a different form of imaginative kind of thinking what can occur in that space. So it becomes this kind of almost even different kind of atmosphere. Like,
is it your way of living with the trouble, as Donna always says? Living with the blur.
Living in the blur, yeah. It's interesting, we were just talking at dinner, and I was in Madrid, and Paul and I both had a conversation there. And in the conversation, when he was also talking about Exodus and the way that he's thinking of working right now, he used this idea, the analogy of a fish can't see the water that they're in, and comparing that to our kind of moment, where within this social media and this kind of intensely mediated environment we are immersed in, all of our realities are so different from one another. Our sense of the world is like a hall of mirrors. It's like, and nobody really understands what is a part of this kind of mess that we're in. And I think that that's part of like that effort. It's that how do you get a sense of the space that you're immersed in if you can't even really see it and understand it.
I was very impressed by the fact that the blurring is so powerful on your pictures now. That, for instance, the photographer who is in charge of illustrating your catalog cannot make the focus on the whole surface of the painting. He has to choose what he is going to lose in the painting. It's exactly the contrary of any kind of mastery and any kind of... It's impossible to map this kind of canvas.
In photographs you can't see what happens in the paintings, and they become obscured because the blur also denies the focus of digital cameras. Have a very difficult time with that. But beyond that, it's the sense of illumination from within. Like some of the paintings really feel lit from inside, and then that light is a big part of what animates and activates what's happening in the painting. It really, in part, sometimes feels like the illumination from the inside to what the image becomes and what is then removed from the image as a reflection, or how does it respond to your body and how you're looking at that. That can become a very uncanny physical experience, a very kind of, and I, again, going back to that place of disorientation or kind of, it participates in that because paintings are usually lit, or, you know, like, or you light these and you have this, it comes, there's an opacity inside of it. There's kind of a, and these feel, there's a different thing that happens in them because they're really not that, that deep or that thick, but there's this sense of this other, you know,
This is
kind
an
of orientation.
experience of painting, which very often a lot of painters put the materiology in charge. I mean, a lot of painters are not do think that it's all the material, the matière, the pigment, who is in charge of giving you the trouble. On the contrary, it's not exactly that. It's much more complex. And I was impressed by the complexity of the operation of transfer, of blurring, and so on. Can you speak a little, because you have a very strong discipline of the studio, and can you speak about it in a way? Because I think it's so important to understand the enchaînement of the operation, one after the other.
I mean, it started so long ago working with other people that different people could bring different technology to you, to the process and to the practice. And there's certain parts of the process that I used to do that certain people who worked with me could do way better than me. And then that became something that I could then push certain aspects of that form of painting. And then there were certain artists who can really like draw particular ways, and you know, they could really get lost into like detailed Baroque aspects of buildings and be able to articulate that and translate a photograph, very small photograph, into a linear drawing or wireframe drawing of something like that. And then others who could only do grids or like could only do particular kinds of work. And I think that it becomes the surface and becomes the materiality of how we evolve the surface. And so different artists I work with really help me with different parts of the process. And it happens almost naturally that when they're in there, they can learn and be, you know, when you're really talented with how you can use your hands, some people can be very like, they can do many different things. And I think, but getting people with precise capabilities, and then those capabilities can really be pushed to different limits, it becomes really interesting. And so as a team, we keep doing that in different ways. And a lot of the people have worked with me for a long time. Some 20 years, some 15 years. Yeah, really.
So long.
Yeah.
Wow.
One has been with me, she's almost 20 years, not quite 20, since 2002. So quite a while. And then the next one is since 2005, 5. So that's quite a while. And the others as well, 10 years, 12 years. So we really, like, and a lot of work has really shifted through that time. So there's been this kind of growth together as a studio when we need to hire up to 30 people to work on paintings like Mural that I did for downtown at the Goldman Sachs lobby, or Howl, which was the paintings that I did for the SF MoMA. They're really different, and the way that we approach them is really different, and the scale of the team I needed to work on them was a different reality.
I should send you my students into Renaissance art to understand how is organized the studio of the artist, you know. They never get it. And they think that Raphael was doing everything by his own hand. So I have to say, no, it's not. It doesn't work like that. When you have 2,000 square meters, you have to do something else.
Well, you were telling me, and I didn't know this about Michelangelo, that...
Oh, yeah.
You were saying, how many assistants?
Yeah, Michelangelo, that's, this is a fantastic book by William Wallace, The Genius as Entrepreneur, and it showed that he went to the archive and so on. He's a fantastic art historian, and he showed that, of course, Michelangelo was working alone in the painting of the roof of the Sixtine, but in all his over chantier, he was working with a team, a complete team of people, and the same people for 30 years, the fathers, the sons, and so on, 380 people, more or less, who were coming from the same district in Firenze, in Florence, and they were all very old friends of him. And he knew the son, and the son went to the atelier to work with him. So Michelangelo was not alone. He was working with a lot of people. And it's interesting because his solitude was real only in the first part of the 16th, but not in the over grit project of him. And this is a mythology of the 19th century who wanted the genius to be a solitary soul, of course, and a white male solitary soul, of course. But he was not. Actually, no, he was really an entrepreneur as well as
that's so
wrote.
interesting.
Yeah, you have to read the book. It's fantastic because it shows us the organization of the studio. It's really interesting.
Wow.
Yeah.
And it's interesting too. Again, going back to the Prado, you'll see paintings that are now attributed, that were attributed to Velázquez, or that were attributed to whoever who was working with Velázquez all those years, who actually was the painter of the painting, and not even touch it, not even like.
Of course.
And so that's also super just interesting as that aspect of.
But come on, if you work 3 years on the portrait of the emperor, you don't have only one copy of it. You do 2, 3, 4, 5 copies of the same portrait. So you have a lot of people working around you. And,
Yeah.
No,
That was
this
amazing.
is really important. But to get back to the collective, I remember you said that you were part of a reading group.
Yes.
And you were part of a project of gardens.
Yes.
And would you like to speak about it?
So this is the project. Denniston Hill is what we call it. It's we set up this project as a nonprofit in the Catskills on this land that we had all made work at one point or another. And this house was a wonderful. It's where I made my first large paintings at this house, and we always had a garden that you could eat from. And then we wanted to kind of activate that, and we weren't going to be there so much, but. There were some other neighbors coming in and buying up houses and creating log cabins and just awful buildings, awful homes, and part of the interest was that you don't want just this whole area to get consumed by the kind of suburban planning that can happen in places where artists find a place for retreat or a place to work. And so we wanted to really kind of take as much of the space as we could and create this this organization that could host artists in residence and writers in residence, architects. We had different classes of architecture actually come and build certain small structures there. And we had always a farmer in residence or a person who worked with plants in residence. And so that person, so they were always at the same dinner table with the artist and with the writer. And this was something that we nourished informally at first, then we formalized it, we became this nonprofit. And then it's only in the last few years that we pushed it to this other level where we really wanted to build the program around these ideas and activate Denniston Hill as a deeper laboratory and place of thinking through a lot of these other kinds of these issues that we're involved in together. And so, we have a community garden program that has all kinds of workshops that we're evolving, and it is a place where anyone can come and participate in the garden, in the public, but we want to actually work with particular kind of partnerships. We have, and that's being evolved right now, we have this Exodus project, which is a media workshop that is really coming out of Paul's practice, but it's something that we are doing as a group that's really trying to investigate these ideas around the ethics of, the kind of aesthetics of uncertainty and kind of the massive array of media that artists have access to and that the world that we are participating with has access to. And so there are certain artists that really work with this material that we have invited and that continue to kind of be part of the core of a larger cohort of artists that we're thinking around with the Exodus Media Workshop, and to kind of participate in a group study operation together that hopefully will evolve into making an artwork collectively and a film or something that we work with students and with artists who collectively work in the group. We're doing that in collaboration with Recess, which is another arts kind of organization project that's performance oriented in New York, and it's working with a lot of kind of previously incarcerated people. And then also we have the reading group, which is a group of us who are reading through the ideas around Exodus. We read the book of Exodus, and translations of that, but we read just recently Zora Neale Hurston's book, Moses, Man of the Mountain, and we're thinking through that narrative again, but from this very kind of, and then combined with different texts, whether it's, Kojo Eshin's kind of text on Afrofuturist music that was produced in this book around sonic art. I can't recall the name of that text at the moment, but whether it was that or the idea around Black Acceleration by Arya Dean, who's a very young kind of artist writer, and then Fred Moten's books and the first chapters of In the Break was something that we considered, or Fumio Kiji, who writes about jazz, and it was this really interesting text on the soloist, not like the primacy around the idea of the soloist in jazz, but really it's the jazz is its intentionality is about participating in the collective, and in terms of historic collective sound and how that becomes this like other form of like engagement. And I thought that was super interesting, the kind of and so relating all these texts to this kind of place of, and so it's really a place of group study. I mean, all of Denniston Hill, that's what its intention is, and it's really beautiful up there.